All right, welcome everyone. This is Dr. Clark from the Center for Weight Loss Success. Today on Losing Weight USA, we're going to talk a little bit about fat. And so, what about fat? We talk about carbohydrate, protein all the time, kind of stress to keep that carbohydrate down low. Make sure you're getting your protein in. But what about fat? How concerning is it for us, as well as how concerning is it a weight loss plan? So we'll kind of hit all the high points there, the good things, the bad things, that kind of thing. All right, welcome Losing Weight USA, real-time answers to your weight loss questions, some of the latest updates and research, as well as a little bit of expert advice. Gives you direct access not only to me, but you should be receiving the health tips and recipes via the membership portal, and I encourage you, get into the membership site. Best way to stay kind of with all the stuff that we keep adding in there, as well as all the behavior modification classes, all of these webinars, access to all the fitness stuff, menus, recipes, etc., etc. All right, each one of these webinars will last about 30 minutes or so. If you have questions, type them into the chat box as we go along. We'll get to them at the end. If you think of things once we're all done, just give us a yell here at the Center for Weight Loss Success. The email is success@cfwls.com. Phone number 757-873-1880. All right, very good. So again, we are talking about fat. Let me switch the slides on. Here we go. All right, I think we are good to go. All right, so again, talking about fat, good news, bad news, that kind of thing. So we'll just go over kind of some of the fat and how it relates to calories. What are the different types of fat? And I want to start off by saying we can't get rid of fat. Fat is something essential that we need to take in. Other types of fats, cholesterol, triglycerides. I've done a whole webinar on cholesterol, triglycerides. We'll touch on that just again. We can't get rid of those things. We die without them. We'll talk about trans fat, which just really is, if you want to call it a bad fat, there is a bad fat. Talk about essential fatty acids, and yep, they are essential. We would die eventually without them. And so then we'll talk about what happens when we ingest fat. What actually happens to it? Is it just used as calories? Is it stored as fat? And then, of course, typically we have a few tips for success. All right, so starting out kind of with fats and calories. And we've probably mentioned this numerous times in the past, but fat is denser in calories. It's 9 calories per gram. A gram is a unit of weight. And carbohydrates are 4 calories per gram. Protein is 4 calories per gram. So fat has denser calorie load. There is more calories per weight. Okay, but we have to realize, and allude to this all the time, it's not just the weight of the food that actually matters. It's more kind of what do the foods do to you after they're eaten, and what do you actually do with those foods? Are they utilized for running all these metabolic things going on in our body, or are they utilized, are they stored as fat? Okay, so kind of it's not just kind of the weight of the food that actually matters. Now, historically, since 1970, so the last 50 plus years, Americans have actually eaten slightly less fat than previously. And so, we often talk about people don't follow direction very well, and there's probably a lot of truth to that statement. But okay, back in the kind of 60s, early 70s, and when people or most physicians, dietitians were all teaching kind of, we need to be on a low-fat diet. And actually, America did listen. They listened because they cut back their fat from about 40% of their dietary intake to about 35%. So they actually did cut back. Now, in that same time frame, though, weight escalated. Okay, and as we learn more about it, it's not so much of, just cutting back on fat, cutting back on some of those calories. It's kind of, okay, the carbohydrates weren't doing as much as we're doing worse things for us than actually the fat was. Scientifically, didn't realize that at the time, but it's kind of played out as we study this more and more. It's more likely it's the carbohydrates making people fat, not necessarily the fat. That doesn't mean you can just go crazy on the fat, though. All right. So, but reality is that historically, we think about, gee, patients don't do what we say as clinicians, but actually they do, and they try anyway. So it's not like people aren't listening; they are listening. Unfortunately, they are also being taught kind of things that weren't quite right. All right, so what about the different types of fat then? I'm kind of mentioned or alluded to there are different types, and cholesterol, triglycerides, they're a type of fat too. So most foods typically aren't all one type of fat. Almost all foods are a mixture of the types of fat. They're usually not all of one. Okay? So even though we'll sometimes classify, like just example, kind of butter, saturated fat, fat that we see on meat, saturated fat. But that's not true, actually. Typically, there's actually a mix of it. So there's a mix of some good fat, bad fat, whatever one wants to call them. And so subsequently, it's not just as simple as saying, oh, this, fat off a steak is bad, butter is bad, you'll hear more and more things that, gee, maybe these other things weren't so bad. And part of that was because we often kind of mislabel things as being specifically one thing versus another thing. And that's not really true. For most fats, they're usually a mixture from saturated, unsaturated, monounsaturated, polyunsaturated. They're usually a mix. All right, but having said that, okay, we do divide some of the types of fat into different subcategories. Monounsaturated fats are actually probably some of the healthiest fats out there. Mono means one, okay? So they're monounsaturated. Basically, it means they're missing a hydrogen in there. So it's unsaturated. It could accept a full, one more hydrogen, and then it would be a saturated fat. So we're talking just one hydrogen difference in some of these things. But monounsaturated fats are typically some of the healthiest fats out there. They're usually liquid at room temperature, as opposed to things that are more saturated fat. I'll use that same example, butter, fat off meat. Typically, even if they're at room temperature, they're still relatively solid. They get softer, temperature kind of goes up, but still kind of they're relatively still solid. So monounsaturated fats, they're usually liquid at room temperature. One of the classic ones is olive oil. Okay, the oil from nuts, the oil from avocados. Typically, these are monounsaturated fatty acids, and these are typically what we often refer to as some of the healthiest fatty acids. All right. Well, the next category is polyunsaturated fatty acids. Poly just means multiple, so more than one, whether it be 2, 3, 4, whatever. Okay. But polyunsaturated means they're missing hydrogen atoms. If they're missing these more than one hydrogen atom, they're almost always liquid at room temperature and in the fridge. Okay. Typically kind of the more closer to saturated these types of fats get, this is again the generality, the closer to the saturated fats they get, the more likely they're going to be relatively solid when they're cooled down. So if they're in the refrigerator, typically they'll be more likely to be more solid. They'll be thicker. Some of them will actually have fairly solid type of thing if they separate some. Okay. But they tend polyunsaturated to almost always liquid at room temperature, and they're usually liquid in the refrigerator as well. Then some examples of that: sunflower oil, safflower oil, flaxseed, soybean, cottonseed, grapeseed, sesame seed. Some polyunsaturated from protein type foods would be some fish. Okay, so sardines, herring, salmon, they typically have some polyunsaturated fatty acids. And for the most part, these are fairly healthy. Now, once we start getting into these man-made ones like margarine, things like that, no, they're not so healthy actually. But some of these that come from natural products, food, plant-based products, some, animal-based products as well, are fairly healthy. And then the one I mentioned earlier, kind of the next thing, is saturated fatty acids. Saturated fatty acids just means that There are no empty spaces along these hydrogen atom, carbon and hydrogen atom molecules. So they're not any double bonds. They're all single bonded. Everything is full. There's no place to add another hydrogen in there. All right. These all tend to be solid at room temperature. And I mentioned the examples here that, butter's often much softer. Fat from meat is often much softer, but usually isn't, liquid. So again, but let's start that initial statement I made. Most fats are a mixture of these different types: monounsaturated, polyunsaturated, saturated fats. And so they're typically a mix, not complete one. Actually, when we talk about like butter and the fat in kind of say beef, they're only about 50% saturated fat. Okay, so even though we call them, often refer to as, gee, it's a more saturated fat, that's true, but it's actually only about half saturated fat. And your body can utilize all three types for fuel. So it's, again, labeling things as good versus bad generally doesn't work all that well when we start talking about food. It's usually not that cut and dried. Okay, so I want to talk just a second, maybe a minute or so, on cholesterol and triglycerides. I had a whole webinar we did a Lose Weight USA on cholesterol and triglycerides. And cholesterol and triglycerides are things we cannot get rid of. Okay, we do not want to get rid of them. They're absolutely essential for life, essential for normal cellular function, hormone production, immunologic response. Cholesterol itself doesn't have any calories, which means that when we take in cholesterol, we don't actually burn it for energy. It's utilized for other things. Okay? Most of the, as I mentioned in the previous webinars, most of the cholesterol in our bloodstream is typically what we make, which our own body can make. Our own body can make cholesterol from different products. Only about 15% of the actual cholesterol in our bloodstream comes from what we eat. So think of that, gee, if I eat a really low cholesterol diet, that it's going to lower my cholesterol way down. That's actually not true. It may lower it a little bit, but not that much, because most of the cholesterol in our bloodstream, in our bodies, is from what we actually make. Okay. Triglycerides also essential for life, but triglycerides also, they can be digested for calories, so they are an energy source. And their triglyceride is made up of 3 fatty acids, that's where the tri comes from, and a glycerol molecule. Glycerol molecule actually comes from sugar. So we make these you can eat triglycerides too, and they're part of the fat that we eat. But our body actually can make these as well. There's 3 fatty acids connected to a glycerol molecule. And glycerol molecule is basically half a sugar. Okay? So the glycerol comes from sugar. So one of the easiest ways to lower your triglycerides is get rid of sugar, get rid of carbohydrate, anything that's broken down to sugar. And that's one of the easiest ways to lower someone's triglycerides. Now, as I mentioned, triglycerides do provide calories, so they are an energy source. They can be burned for energy. And that's where a lot of the fat that are stored in our subcutaneous tissue. We talk about someone being fat, overweight. So a lot of the fatty cells in there are filled with triglycerides. Trans fat's something I want to talk, because this is one when I said, gee, you can't really call them all good or all bad. Trans fat is something you can call bad. Okay, this is what I would definitely refer to as the bad fat. Okay, because there is a direct association between the intake of trans fats and an increase for heart disease, specifically myocardial infarctions. Okay. Now, trans fat is a man-made fat. See, our body doesn't make trans fats. Okay, and trans fats are made from basically unsaturated fatty acids. So unsaturated fat, whether it be monounsaturated, polyunsaturated, that's where trans fats actually come from. Now, the food industry got, back 40, 50 years ago, when they developed trans fat, because it's a man-made fat. doesn't actually occur naturally in our bodies. It's a man-made fat. The reason it was brought about is because it actually can help with product preservation. It'll keep a lot longer, looks a lot fresher, tastes a lot fresher by using these trans fats. Unfortunately, they end up causing a lot of problems. So anything that's has a long shelf life, probably Twinkies, anything that has a long shelf life, typically had a lot of trans fat in it. And so subsequently it kept shelf life, kept them fresh, because you could sell them, you could keep them around your store for a long period of time, you can keep them at home for a long period of time. So since we learned that kind of trans fats overall are a bad fat, again, they increase inflammatory conditions. They worsen inflammatory conditions. Myocardial infarction is just one of those. They worsen inflammatory conditions. Since 2006, so again, 15, 16, so however many years ago, the nutrition label has to label on there how much trans fat is in there. And most things nowadays, because I had to list it, we know it's bad, are pretty much zero. Just realize that that's somewhat of a marketing ploy. And we talked about labeling on, a number of months ago, I think, in one of these webinars. And it's a somewhat of a marketing ploy because a company can claim there's zero if it has less than 0.5 grams per serving. Now, sometimes serving size is very small, and sometimes we eat multiple servings, things like that. So it may be, even though it's listed as zero, that you may be getting some significant trans fat. For that reason, I encourage people to really avoid kind of those shelf-stable products out there that you pick up at 7-Eleven and all the things that have these shelf-stable carbohydrate, generally high carbohydrate products, is they're typically do have trans fat in them. Same thing with kind of fried foods. In fried foods, typically is that when the process of frying the food, some of the fat that's in there gets transformed into trans fats. So typically avoiding fried food is always a good idea. Avoiding over-processed food is always a good idea. This is just one of the reasons why it's a bad idea to eat those things. So, but I realize we probably get exposed intermittently from all these things. But trans fat is something you want to try to avoid. Anything that on the label says shortening, hydrogenated vegetable oil, partially hydrogenated vegetable oil, if that's listed on the ingredients, very likely it does have trans fats in it. So again, the most common culprits: fried foods, baked goods, cookies that are really shelf stable, crackers, some candies that are out there, a lot of snack foods, a lot of icings, vegetable shortenings. They get transformed into trans fats. Trans fats are not a good thing. And again, they can label it as zero, even if it has less than 0.5 grams per serving. And we often eat multiple servings. All right, so trans fat, avoid them. Essential fatty acids, or EFAs. When we say EFAs, that's what we're talking about, essential fatty acids. And just like the name implies, they're essential. They're essential for life. Literally, we need them. Okay, so these two families that are essential for life, that your body can't produce. They typically are a form of polyunsaturated fatty acids, but we can't actually make these, and we need them. So we have to take them in from food. And that's the omega-6s and the omega-3s. Omega-6, omega-3, it's just saying the difference there is where is that open hydrogen, the missing hydrogen from the chemical structure, and the carbon molecules are labeled 1 through whatever, however many there are. So omega-6 just says where this carbon was located that has the free bond or the double bond. The omega-3s is where this actually occurs along this chain. Okay, so omega-6s, omega-3s, we can't live without them. We need to take them in. Typically, they're good source, and generally, and this is a generality as well, omega-6s, really, really easy to get them from just normal everyday eating. Omega-3s, we have to be more conscious of, hey, are we getting enough omega-3s in? And that's why kind of a lot of people take fish oil supplements, flax seeds, so there are other things that have omega-3s in them. So the omega-3s typically aren't so easily obtained from just normal everyday eating. Okay. Good sources of omega-3s are cold water fish. So tuna, herring, sardines, anchovies, but then there are also some non-fish sources as well: flaxseed, almond, walnuts, DHA from algae, so like kelp, algae, those kind of things, stuff that the fish normally would be eating, we're just getting before they go into the fish. Right, so omega-3s, those are the ones we need to concentrate on because we get plenty of omega-6s. Okay? And you want to have the right ratio in there. And it's really easy to get your omega-6s in, somewhat more difficult to get the omega-3s in. It's kind of that, but typically essential fatty acids aren't used so much as an energy source. They're more as what I'll refer to as a metabolic lubricant. It's kind of like the oil in the car's engine. And subsequently, the gasoline is kind of where we're getting the fuel from to kind of run our body. We're able to run around all day and do stuff. Essential fatty acids are more like the lubricant. And it's like the oil that makes everything work well, but they're not actually necessarily being burned as energy source. It helps everything else work better. All right, so essential fatty acids, those are good. Trans fats, bad. Okay. So shifting gears, what happens to when we ingest fat? So when we eat fat, what actually happens to the fat? Well, it depends. And it depends on what your cells are actually told to do. And part of that is are the enzymes used to either utilize the fat as an energy source, or the enzymes that are turned on to store the fat for a future energy source, meaning stored in your fatty tissue. So whether you store it or utilize it is very dependent on what your body tells it to do. And what I mean by that is that typically carbohydrate plays a huge role in this. It's carbohydrate that increases insulin levels. We talk about this probably weekly. Insulin is the hormone that turns on an enzyme called lipoprotein lipase. Lipoprotein lipase is an enzyme that tells your cells to absorb the fat from your bloodstream and store it. Okay? So the higher the insulin levels are, the more likely you're going to take that ingested fat, the fat that we eat, and actually store it. Okay? Now, if your insulin levels are really low, then you're less likely to store it. You're more likely to use it as an energy source. But insulin is the master hormone here that actually controls this at any level. So insulin levels go up, you're going to store fat. Insulin levels come down, you're going to mobilize fat. It's not quite as cut and dry and say there's not like, oh, if it's this level, then you're mobilizing fat. It's more of, if you think of storing fat versus mobilizing and using fat as a two-way street. And typically, if there's more traffic going in the storage direction, you're gaining weight. If there's more traffic going in the mobilization direction, you're losing weight. So, and what turns this on and off, of what direction these fatty molecules are going, insulin plays an absolute key role there. So it really is very dependent on insulin. Insulin is subsequently, for any individual, is often many times dependent on how much carbohydrate you eat. Now, as I've said before, it's not quite that simple because literally anything we eat that has calories in it will raise insulin levels. Carbohydrate does it the most. Protein doesn't do it quite as much, and fat actually does it the least. But anything you eat can raise insulin levels. The more carbohydrate you eat, higher that insulin goes. Higher insulin goes, more likely you're going to take the fat that you eat and store it as fat. All right, so that is kind of the dependent. I can't find my little, there we go. There we go. All right, so finishing it up, writing this down, kind of talking about fats here. Fats are very important. We can't live without them, okay? So dietary fat is essential to good health. It's like we would die without this. We cannot get, there's no such thing as carbohydrate deficiency. There absolutely is such thing as fat deficiency. So dietary fat is absolutely essential to good health. You can't actually store the fat you eat unless your carbohydrate intake is high enough to increase your insulin level. And that's why I often tell people, there's a tipping point, your carbohydrate tipping point. That's where this comes from. At a certain level of carbohydrate intake, insulin levels go up, you're going to start storing fat. And that's a matter of how sensitive someone is to carbohydrates. Little slightly different topic, but something we also hit on fairly commonly. So as long as you're eating a fairly high carb diet, you typically aren't going to burn your own body fat for energy because it's going to lose, it's not mobilizing the fat because it's in the direction of fat storage. Just about everybody should increase their omega-3 fatty acids. It's an essential fatty acid. We get our omega-6 very easily. It's difficult for us to get all the omega-3s. Again, either take a supplement, essential fatty acids, or get it from the high omega-3 fatty acid foods. Okay. Cholesterol, triglycerides, again, they're minimally related to the dietary fat intake. Only a small amount, about 15% of the cholesterol in our body is related to what we actually eat. Most of it is related to what we actually make. And that's why genetics play a whole major role in kind of cholesterol levels, lipid levels, things like that. All right. Questions? I don't see on that. We didn't, wasn't too long a webinar there, but basically I filled up most of the time there. If you have questions, don't hesitate. Pick up the phone, send an email, give us a yell, stop by the office. You can get your body comp done. So encourage people, come by and get that done. Stop by the Center for Weight Loss Success, get your body comp done. Yeah, if you want to get something in a nutritional store, make sure you are logging into the membership site, membership portal, picking up the weight loss tips as well as weekly recipes. Tune in each Tuesday, 12:15 for the next webinar. Watch your email for the invite and link. And remember, it's your life. Make it a healthy one. Have a good day, everyone. Take care.